Welcome to the MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism today. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Hey guys, welcome to this brand new podcast called MessianTics, in which we will be discussing as two Jews and four opinions everything there is within Messianic Judaism and probably everything on the outside of it too. But we've got four Messianic rabbis, two senior, two associate rabbis or assistant rabbis, and then beyond that, we've also got two generations of Messianic Jew, Messianic rabbis on this podcast, and it should be rather entertaining. So I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves first and foremost with the oldest in the room.
That would be me, and I'm Rabbi Eric Tokajer, and just excited about this podcast, excited about delving into a lot of your questions, things that are on your mind, how Messianic Judaism relates to different things. And as Rabbi David said, we have two Jewish members on this podcast, two non-Jewish members, but all rabbis, all teachers of God's Word. And so we're going to get different perspectives generationally, different perspectives, backgrounds, and heritage-wise. And so it should be an entertaining process.
I am Toby Manolis, assistant rabbi to Rabbi David Tokajer at Congregation Mayim Chayim. And I am one of the non-Jewish opinions at the table. And I have a interesting background in the sense that my situation was I was born into the Baptist church and spent, about 25 years in the Baptist / non-denominational Christian church expression of my faith before being called into Messianic Judaism in 2005, which is where I've been, have led and have participated and have had the opportunity to be a leader in youth and in worship, and now in a congregational setting and rabbinic ministry. It's been an honor and excited to be here. I'm really honored to be a part of this, and happy you guys are willing to allow me to tag along. So nice to meet everybody.
Yeah, and I'm Jonathan Wriston. I'm the assistant rabbi at Brit Ahm Messianic Synagogue. I serve under Rabbi Eric Tokajer, and I've been here 2 years this Rosh Hashanah.
Which is crazy to think about, that he's been around for 2 years now. I was just thinking the other day, somebody posted on Facebook of 2 years ago, and I was like, wow, it seems like weeks, and it's been 2 years.
Too much has happened in those 2 years. But it's been a good 2 years, and I'm glad that, because this podcast has been, we've talked about this for at least 6 months. I think longer.
Yeah, it's been a while, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm glad we're finally getting started. And I'm the other non-Jewish opinion that is found on this podcast, so I'm glad to be able to share.
And so as we talk about this Jewish, non-Jewish thing, and we're going to get into our own personal backgrounds and share some of our own history, but for those listening, just understand that the nation of Israel, going back to Abraham, has never been just descendants of Abraham, just Jewish people, just Hebrews. You know, Abraham and Sarah were the first Hebrews. They crossed over. That's what the word Eber means, to cross over. And they became the first Hebrews. But they had a child named Isaac, and Isaac needed a wife, so they had to cross back over and get a wife for Isaac, who then crossed back over and joined or was grafted in with Abraham's family. And so that's how it went on. And those children married some people from within the Hebrew people and some from outside. And then Israel goes into Egypt, and they have the mixed multitude comes out with them. And ultimately, when Israel crosses into the Promised Land, they're led by Joshua, a Hebrew or a Jew or an Israelite, and Caleb, a Gentile, a Kenizzite, who goes in. And so when we talk about this relationship, understand that while there's division and this middle wall of partition keeps getting built up by both the Jewish community and the Christian community to divide the people into two camps, Yeshua's prayer was that we would be one as he and the Father are one. And so that's how we're trying to live out our lives. So it doesn't make Gentiles Jewish when they become Messianic, but it does make them part of the Commonwealth of Israel and part of this community that God had established.
Yes.
And last but not least, the first voice you heard as we started this podcast out, I am David Tokajer, rabbi, senior rabbi now, which sounds weird, but senior rabbi of Congregation Mayim Chayim in Daphne, Alabama. And I just want to say, look, that was not really a planned part of the conversation, diving into the Jew and Gentile. I mean, it is, but not for this episode. But I want to leave that as a teaser for you, because our second episode of MessianTics, we're going to go full no holds bar on that very issue, because the reality is, in the body of Messiah, Jew and Gentile as one, there's still a lot of problems and a lot of disagreement. And within the Messianic Jewish movement, there are a lot of those of the nations who don't feel like they necessarily have a home in the place that they're called to, because some Messianic leaders, some congregations make them, for whatever reason or in whatever way, feel as though they're not as important or valued or second class or what have you. And so we want to really dive into that discussion on our second episode, especially because of the fact that we are uniquely able to have that conversation, because we both are all four of us are part of congregations that are led by a Jewish senior rabbi and an assistant non-Jewish rabbi, and so it's really a fun discussion for us to dive into in the next episode. So please, if our voices don't scare you away, we definitely want you to stick around for the next episode and for the rest of this. But as we're moving forward, I just want to kind of give us an opportunity to banter some about where we all come from, how we got into all of this. We always joke and say that Messianic Judaism is like granola. You get a lot of fruits, nuts, and flakes, and so we all have kind of our own backgrounds and our own way that we got into this journey and into this life. And so I just want us to kind of take a few moments and banter around about how we all became believers, how we got plugged into Messianic Judaism, why we're here after all of these years, and kind of what our hope and goal for not only the podcast but the future of Messianic Judaism really is.
So I'll jump in as the oldest. So I was raised in a conservadox Jewish home. My family raised me in synagogue. I had a bar mitzvah in my synagogue. My family is Jewish on both sides as far back as goes. Matter of fact, we did a DNA test, and it shows 100% European Jewish in my background. So that's my background. I was raised in synagogue. I went to synagogue every week. We went to minyan. I went to Hebrew school. I had a bar mitzvah. And then after my bar mitzvah, myself and my brothers led Shabbat liturgy at our synagogue. And that went along until I was about 14 years old. I went from Hebrew school to what they called Hebrew high school in my synagogue, and at that point I started actually studying the scripture instead of studying Judaism. Up until my bar mitzvah, I learned Hebrew, I learned the history of Judaism, I learned the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I learned about the Holocaust, I learned many of those things, but we didn't actually dig into actual scriptural study. So when I began to study the actual scripture, and I found that there was a required Yom Kippur sacrifice that was not being made, I started to question, how are our sins atoned for if we don't have a Yom Kippur sacrifice? At that point, the rabbis that I interacted with would tell me, well, we do good works, we do acts of tzedakah and righteous deeds, and give tzedakah or give offerings and donations and charity and such, and that's how our sins are covered. And I asked them, where in the Torah or the Tanakh does it validate that? Where do we see that we can do good works to cover our sins or to have atonement? When they couldn't give me any answers, it went on. And then in 1967, an event happened, because up until then, the answer was, well, we don't have a temple. We can't make sacrifices on the mountain. We can't do those things. But in 1967, Israel took Jerusalem. And when they took Jerusalem, I started asking the questions, why aren't we making sacrifices? When Ezra and Nehemiah returned to Israel, they didn't have a temple, they didn't have a mishkan, a tabernacle, but they immediately set up a altar and started doing the sacrifices again. And now we have Jerusalem. We no longer have an excuse. We can't say we can't do this because we don't have the hill, the mountain that is required for making these sacrifices. So why aren't we doing this? When we couldn't find any answers for that, I really became agnostic because I wanted desperately to believe in God, but I wanted to believe in the God of the Bible, and it didn't appear that my people were consistent in how they followed him. And so I became agnostic. I started searching other things and other answers. And when I was in the Navy, a believer in Yeshua, he called him Jesus at the time, but a believer in Yeshua started sharing with me and bringing about some answers to those questions I had about where atonement came. And after 9 months of studying the overwhelming evidence of the Messiahship of Yeshua in the Tanakh, not in the Brit Ahm, the New Covenant, but in the Tanakh, brought me to a place of seeing that Yeshua was the atonement promised in the Torah and the Tanakh, and so I became a believer in Yeshua. It was after that sometime that I became felt a call to ministry, and I became actually a Christian pastor for a while. And it's a time I call my wilderness experience, when I was out of Judaism and into Christianity. And it was through Christianity and through that realm and being a pastor of a church in Alabama that I was praying one day, and I heard the voice of the Lord speak to me. Now, whether I heard it audibly or in my heart or whatever, it doesn't really matter. That part's not relevant, but the Lord said, "You're a Jew, live like one." And so I went to my wife and I said, "I don't know exactly what this means or how we're going to do it, but this is what the Lord spoke." And she immediately responded in a very positive way. "Okay, whatever the Lord leads you, we'll just do." So we started having a Friday night Shabbat service at our church, and then a regular Sunday service. It was through that somebody contacted us and told us about Messianic Judaism, because we didn't even know it existed. We were in a realm where we didn't have cable TV. We didn't have those things. We didn't know that Messianic Judaism. I've never heard of Zola Levitt or any of the people that were on TV. I didn't know there were other Jewish people that had this experience. And so somebody from Mobile came and connected with us and said, "Hey, there's this group of Jewish believers in Jesus in Mobile. You ought to check this out." So we went and visited, felt so at home and so immediately like this is where I belong, that we started driving an hour and a half every Shabbat so that we could join them in service on Friday evening, and then we would come back to where we lived and have our Sunday service at our church. And through transitioning and all, ultimately I became the leader of the congregation there in Mobile, and that's where David got introduced to Messianic Judaism, and I guess that's probably a good point for me to toss it to him and let him share his experience.
So, yeah, like I said in the beginning, I'm a second-generation rabbi, second-generation Messianic Jew, second-generation rabbi, and I was in, I guess, elementary school when we started filling a call, or my dad started filling a call to Messianic Judaism. And what's funny is that it was actually kind of a point of contention between us for a little while, because when I was little, my whole life, I never felt comfortable in a church. I couldn't explain it. That was when I was little. That was really all I knew. My parents were both believers. They were in a church, and that was all I knew. But it never felt like home. It never felt comfortable to me. It never felt like the right fit. And so one day, and I grew up with my dad saying, "We're not Jewish anymore. We're now Christians, and all that Jewish stuff doesn't matter." And da-da-da. And so one day I was in his closet, and I found this little velvet wrapped box in his closet, and I pull it out and I'm looking through it, and it's got this, what I later found out, I didn't know at the time, but what I later found out was his Kiddush cup from his bar mitzvah, and his talis from his bar mitzvah, and his siddur, his prayer book from his bar mitzvah, and a mezuzah necklace that was, I think, given to him for his bar mitzvah, and all this kind of stuff. It was all this intricate Judaica, part of actual Jewish life and practice, that was in the box. I don't remember, it may have even had a set of tefillin in it, I don't remember, but nonetheless, all of this stuff in this little velvet box, that while my dad's telling me we're no longer Jewish, and I'm getting into like actual fights and arguments in school with people, explaining to them how I could be Jewish and be a believer in Jesus at the same time, even though I knew nothing about Messianic Judaism. And I'm getting in trouble for that conversation. And my dad's getting on to me because we're not Jewish anymore. We're now Christian and whatever. Here I find this little trinket box, this memento box from his bar mitzvah that he's kept all these years, that if it really didn't matter, why did you hold this stuff? Why did this keep back? And so we got involved with Messianic Judaism, and so it was kind of a point of contention to some degree, because I wanted to kind of rebel against it in some ways, not because I didn't feel like it was the right fit. I did 100%. But because I was told all this time that stuff doesn't matter and we're not that anymore, and so you don't need. And then now all of a sudden the switch flips and this is our life. But the reality is that the majority of my life, all I've really known is Messianic Judaism. I've grown up in Messianic Judaism, and I didn't want to be a rabbi at all. My dad can tell you probably countless different career paths I had intended to take at one point or another, and my number one desire in life when I was in high school was to go in the Marine Corps, and that was the only goal I had, was to go into the Marine Corps. And I tried numerous times to go in, and God kept shutting the door, but I also have known my whole life what my calling was. I've always known I was supposed to be a rabbi. There were prophetic words spoken over me before I was born, after I was born, growing up, over and over and over again, that were always 100% verbatim. He's going to be a great leader of his people. And it was a really weird choice of wording, but he was going to be a great leader of his people, not a great leader in the church, not a great leader in the marketplace, not a great leader in whatever. He's going to be a great leader of his people.
Yeah, and I want to say that the fact that David has used the word contention several times, understand that we have spent our whole life having moments of contention. So as we talk about our lives and share on this podcast, understand that although we're walking in the same direction, there's been lots of times that we bumped our heads in this. And matter of fact, when he graduated from high school and got married, I was fully convinced we would never see him in synagogue again, because the last year before he got married was one big contention. We were constantly at odds with each other, and I thought, as long as he's in my house, he's going to go to synagogue and he's going to do what I tell him to do. And then he got married very young and moved out, and I was like, okay, I'm never going to see him again. But he never missed a service. And so it shocked me that, and the fact that he became a rabbi, although it was prophesied, it was like one of those things that, God said this was going to happen, but this is going to take the parting of the Red Sea, or this is going to take the world, the earth opening up.
And in a way, it kind of was, because, like I said, my only goal was to go in the Marine Corps. And, like he said, I got married early, so my wife knew that. Like, she knew when we got married that was my goal. We'd already been together for 3.5 years when we got married. And so she knew that was the only goal I had. And God kept shutting the door down in absolutely absurd ways. And I won't go into all of them, but just absolutely absurd ways that there's no, like, I failed a urinalysis. I'd never taken drugs a day in my life. I failed a urinalysis because it's something completely awkwardly different. And that shut a door down. And so finally I felt like God told me again, like my father said a few moments ago, whether it was literally the audible voice or an inclination on the heart, I tend to lean towards, in that scenario, I think it was an inclination that I felt his voice in my heart, not that I heard this audible encounter, but nonetheless, I felt the Lord say, this isn't what I created you for. This isn't who I called you to be. But this is the last time I shut the door. If you try to do this again, if you try to go in the Marine Corps again, I'm going to let you succeed, and I will let you deal with the consequences. And it was at that moment that I kind of, very literally, and I've talked about this in our congregation, very literally just kind of threw in the towel and stopped fighting. It wasn't like I was necessarily on board with the rabbi thing, but I was just tired of running and fighting. And I gave in and went that right now. I love it. But that's how I got involved with ministry.
Yeah. In a moment, we're going to hear from Toby and let him share kind of how he got there, and then and Jonathan. But I wanted to remind everybody that a big part of our intention for this podcast is that you'll interact with us by bringing us topics or questions or things that you would like us to respond to and talk about on the podcast. So if you have one of those, you can go to our Facebook page, MessianTics, and put it on there.
Messianic Podcast.
Messianic Podcast, and put the the question or the comment or the subject on there, and we will do our best to do so in an upcoming podcast. So, Toby, if you'll go ahead and share, you already said a little, you came from a Baptist background, but what happened to get you kind of into Messianic?
So I grew up in the Baptist church. My relationship with God was very real. I had the Messiah. Of course, I knew him as Jesus. And absolutely no semblance of Judaism. It was Baptist church, But my relationship with God was real. I remember the first time I remember the first time I felt the move of the Holy Spirit to direct me to do something. I was at a youth camp. I was 11, and I was really too young to be in youth, but for some reason, the youth leader decided, hey, we want to give Toby a chance to come on this youth. It was in Panama City. It was called Super Wow. They have these names like Big Stuff and all this. Anyway, I'm not making fun, but because God does reach people at these places, I'm sure there are kids that go there just to whatever, just, to hang out or knock a beach ball around or just, hang out with friends or whatever, but, get away from parents. But for me, I really wanted to, to see what God had for me, even though, I was 11 years old. And I remember the very last day they had this big invitation. I was already saved. I'd already made a public profession of faith in my church, but my parents weren't there at this. It was just me and a bunch of older high school kids whose nerves I was getting on incessantly because I was this little sixth grader. And I'm sitting there and people are going forward, and I just remember getting up and walking and not even knowing. I remember thinking, what am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing. But God, so he moved on me while I was in the church. And he called me into ministry when I was 14. Now, of course, I didn't enter ministry until I was 25 in the Messianic movement, but I was in the church. I was 14. I went to another youth retreat, and the leaders at this youth retreat, it's called Impact in Tokajer, Georgia. I don't even remember their names. I wish I'd remember their names so I could call them up and say, God used you to inspire me to desire to be a leader. I wanted to pay forward and inspire other people to pursue God the way they did for me. So I felt called. And so I was 14 though, and then 15, 16, 17. I'm still in the church. I'm not in leadership. And then 18, 19, I get into college, and I never sinned again, right? God called you, and that's it. No, of course, I had wayward seasons. I guarantee you there were times when you could have talked to me when I wouldn't even remember that day when I was 14 and God called me. I was like, whatever. Yeah. Maybe I was wrong, but to talk about the church, I was at a place where when I got into my late teens, early 20s, I don't want to, because God does, and the people in the church are just as saved as I am and just as loved by God as I am, but it got incredibly stale. Something like all the power I just was like, I don't want to do this anymore. So for several years, I'd say from probably 18 to 19 until I was about 25, I was not involved in the church at all. I think I went to one church for a few months. I did. It was a non-denomination. It was a few months.
Wow.
And I washed out right away. And then my dad called me up and said, hey, Toby. And my dad he's a big guy. He's kind of, he's serious. He's not incredibly emotional. He calls me up and he says, Toby, have you ever heard of Messianic Judaism? And I said, I've heard of Judaism. I've not heard of Messianic Judaism. I was in college. I'd taken a world religions class. I'd heard of Judaism. I knew Jesus was Jewish, He goes, Messianic Judaism, Toby, is Jewish people who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. He goes, and he starts to explain this to me. I'm like, Dad, where did all this come from? He goes, I don't know why. He said, but I was at work one day, and he's talking to me like he's never spoken to me before. My dad has never talked to me like this. He's not Jewish. He grew up in the church just like I did. And he said, Toby, I suddenly had this desire to read every book about Judaism that I could. I suddenly desired to give a tithe to a Jewish organization. This is God calling. He goes, I don't know where it came from, but it was an insatiable hunger. He goes, and I found out that there's a synagogue in Macon, Georgia. It's called Beth Yeshua. It's a Messianic synagogue. He said, I went, and Toby, it changed my life.
Yeah.
And I'm out of the church. I still believe that God's real. I still believe that Jesus is the Messiah. But I'm out of church. And I had felt convicted, though, recently about being at a church. And I didn't know where to go. I remember I visited a church, nothing. But I went up to my mom and I said, Mom, my parents are divorced, by the way. We'll learn more about each other as time goes on. But I said, Mom, I think we should try to go to this Messianic synagogue. And I'll tell you why. I said, I have never heard Dad talk about a place like this, and I've never heard him cry when he talks about God or cry when he really talks about anything until he started talking about this place. I said, I think we need to go. We went. I walked in. It was that they were using a church at the time. Beth Yeshua has its own building now down in Macon, but they were using a church. I walked in, and this guy opened the door. He was wearing what I came to know later as a talit. He said, Shabbat Shalom. He whispered it to me because service had already started. We were a little late. And we go in, and I immediately, it was like when you walk into a room, when you've been outside in the hot air and you walk in and the air conditioner's been running in this room and you feel a sudden change in temperature. It was like the presence of God immediately. I walked in. And the entire service, it was about a 2-hour service, and I couldn't tell you every single thing about the service, but I can tell you the things I remember. But I do remember one thing the entire time is that I kept holding back tears. I couldn't stop crying. It was when I heard the Hebrew. It was when I saw the talits. It was when I heard the words of the liturgy, like the ancient prayers, that were spoken in the language that the Messiah would have spoke. Yeshua. Now I'm hearing Yeshua no longer just like, but in my mind still I'm thinking, oh, that's how it would have sounded when Jesus said it. So it was wrecking me. And it was all in one day. And it wasn't because I wanted to be Jewish. So if somebody asked me, it wasn't about wanting to be Jewish, or it was about that's what Jesus did. That's what Yeshua did. And that's what I want to do. I want to do it exactly the way he did it. And there was such a power in it. I'll never forget that day, because since that day, which is August 27, 2005, and you can check the calendars, it was a Shabbat, it's August 27, 2005, I have not looked back. And, 3 months after attending the synagogue, I started playing bass on the worship team. And then from there, it went into being a worship leader. And then it went into being youth leadership. And I just... I never looked back. I know I've talked a while, but I'm sure we'll all learn more about each other's stories as we go on. But that was how I came into Messianic Judaism. God called my dad, and then he told me, and then but it's I've never looked back. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So I'm Jonathan Wriston. For those of you listening, like I said at the beginning, I'm the assistant rabbi here with Brit Ahm, with Rabbi Eric, and so I'm very similar Toby background. Grew up, my father has Church of God background, mother has Baptist background, so I grew up with kind of a blend of the two. So grew up in a very, very Christian household. Biblical education was very important. We were me and my siblings were homeschooled for most of our education, and so we were very familiar with the Bible, knew the Bible. At least so we thought, but every good Baptist, knows the Bible, right? Anyway, so get through high school, you go to church with your folks, and that was where I was. I was saved at the age of 4 and was just, trying my best to walk with God as much as I knew how each and every day. And, so I get out of high school and I go off to college, and of course, I'm just kind of entered this season of that lull, I guess, and I was very involved with both ROTC and my studies. So Sundays were kind of like became a sleep / rest / study day for me, and so I really stopped going to church and kind of got out from under the influence of the church. And I went a handful of times in school to a local Baptist school or local Baptist church. And then eventually I moved to Vermont to continue my studies. And I was talking to some young guys about having a conservative speaker on board. And that was during the whole election year with Trump. And I was like, we should have a conservative speaker come on campus to kind of, get rid of, put down some of these liberal, students on here, which is, looking back was kind of ridiculous. But so all these guys that I was talking to, they were leaders in the local Bible study group there in the local Christian, the Students Association. And So they invited me that night after talking about that. They said, yeah, we'll think about inviting a conservative speaker. And then they were like, hey, you want to join us for Bible study? And I was like, oh, yeah, sure. I was like, I haven't been part of a Bible study in a while. And then it was led by this elderly French-Canadian gentleman who lived not too far from the campus. And he led all these young men in this weekly Bible study. And so I began to get slowly reintroduced to making Bible study and Bible talk and talking about the Bible and living out the Bible a regular part of my life again. Not that I ever left it. I never left my faith. I never stopped praying or talking with God. But I did leave fellowship. I left community when I was away from home, and so that drew me back in to being in fellowship and in community. And slowly but surely, I would start reading things and listening to things that were associated with the Messianic movement. I listened to people who online on YouTube for different reasons. They weren't so much talking about their faith; they're talking about other subjects, but their faith would come out as they would talk about their things. And one of those things was Shabbat, and so they would talk about keeping Shabbat, why it was important for believers in Jesus. So a lot of them use Jesus, some of them use Yeshua. At the time, it's important to for us as believers to imitate Jesus if we're believers in Jesus. And I thought, man, that's imitating the Messiah. Like that sounds interesting because I it sounds kind of copycatish. But the more I learned about discipleship and what it meant to follow Yeshua, the more I began to understand that, imitation is discipleship. Discipleship is imitation. That's what it means to follow the Messiah, is to live like him, to take his teachings and employ them daily in our lives. And so slowly but surely, through the things I was reading, and again, I'll talk about lots of those things as we continue this podcast, but I was reading things and hearing things, and slowly but surely was beginning to incorporate the keeping of a Sabbath, which was really interesting, to be the lone friend in college on campus keeping Shabbat as best you could, because all your friends, Saturday is the day to go out, Friday night's the night to go out, so to tell your friends, nah man, I think I'm just going to stay in the room for tonight, and not only was I in college, but I was also in the Guard. So I was both military and college student. So partying on Friday night was almost like part of the package deal. But I had left all that and continued to kind of do as much as I could on my own through college, and didn't really believe that this existed anywhere else. I knew there were individuals I heard online talk about keeping the Torah, keeping the commandments, but I didn't really know that there was such a thing as Messianic Judaism. I didn't know there was an actual way of living like this together in fellowship. And so I left college, moved back home, and was trying to do my best to do the commandments there and live those out. And it got kind of weird for a little bit with my folks, because Jonathan went off to college. Last we left him a Lutheran,
right?
And then comes back practicing aspects of Judaism. Practice the old law, the old covenant. All the typical things, and so tried doing that a few months. It just got very, very difficult, very bleak. No fellowship, no community. That is a tough thing to go through. So I got on Google and just started looking, and eventually I found this little place in Dothan, Alabama, Dothan Messianic Fellowship. And I said, well, okay, maybe I really need to go try to visit this place. So I ended up going one Saturday and forgot my phone. And so I couldn't find the place. And so I just had to go back home, and I missed the first time I tried to go. So was it a God thing? Maybe, I don't know. The next week I went and I found it. And as I'm leaving my car, I'm just kind of praying silently, God, if the people here are, if the fruit of the Spirit is evident in the lives of the people here, and they're keeping the commandments, I want to stay here if that's what they're doing. And I walked up and hadn't even gotten to the door yet, and one of the deacons, Bill, had Shabbat Shalom really loudly, so kind of the opposite of.
That's because you were on time,
right?
That's what I was on time. That was the Lutheran in me, being on time. I became Messianic, and it's all been downhill from there. But So walked in and, met the leadership there and got very involved and never left.
Yeah.
And I just stayed and,
Just didn't look back. Yeah.
Yeah. And I began to learn Hebrew and to really study. And, I knew the there were commandments in the Torah, and had grown up with the narrative of, Genesis of Abraham and the Israelites leaving, but I never had really realized the greater depths that the Torah allows us to see, and is walking with Yeshua.
Exactly how he did. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of a short introduction into the 4 of our escapades on the way to Messianic Judaism.
Yes.
And finding it, because it's amazing how many people. Now, David was raised in it, so he didn't have to kind of search it out, but God's kind of searched him out. But the other 3 of us were like, I didn't even know this existed, and yet it's exactly what the Bible shares, teaches, and the example that the apostles, the Shalachim, gave to us. And so that's probably a pretty good place for us to stop this week, but I want to remind everybody again that you can, if you want to give us ideas or thoughts or subjects for future podcasts, that you just go to Facebook page, which is
at MessianTics Podcast.
At Messianic Podcast. Put it on there, like the page, forward the page, share the page, do all the social stuff to make this happen. And remember, our next podcast, we're going to delve directly into, we're jumping off the high dive into the deep water of the Jew-Gentile.
One new man.
Yeah, that's exciting.
I will say before we go, I love that God didn't let you into the Marine Corps, but kind of kept you in the direction you needed to go, and that even though you didn't go into the Marines, your life still kind of lived out the Marines' motto, which is Semper Fidelis, the Latin for always faithful.
Yeah.
So I think that's
awesome.
Absolutely the hand of God.
And as we go through this podcast, you'll also be introduced to our wives and our families, and we're going to be plain and upfront with stuff. So we're quirky. We've got weird sense of humors. We're going to delve into different things, but we're also going to be real. This isn't going to be a show where we're not perfect. And if you mistakenly think any of us are perfect, you can ask any of our wives, and they'll straighten you out very quickly on that.
Yes, indeed.
And so with that, we will fare you goodbye until next time. Thank you for listening to the MessianTics Podcast, Episode 1, and we will see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.